Hi, welcome. Thank you all for coming. Both the colleges, St. Benedict and St. John's University, occupy the original homelands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe people. We honor, respect, and acknowledge the indigenous people forcibly removed from this territory, whose connections remain today. St. Benedict's Monastery and St. John's Abbey previously operated boarding schools for Native children. Now students, faculty, and staff are working to repair relationships with our Native Nation neighbors. The land acknowledgement I just read is specific to our institutions, but it can't be fully understood without two important points that give it national context. First, the United States' effort to separate indigenous people from their land and children from their parents at boarding schools, these were nationwide efforts. The Native American boarding schools on and adjacent to our campuses today were part of a system of over 500 schools designed to force assimilation through family separation. And here's the other important point for national context. Today, across the United States, communities and organizations are working with indigenous communities, taking some of the very first baby steps towards truth and healing. St. Benedict's Monastery and St. John's Abbey are part of this movement. And one of the key organizers who's worked with them in these efforts, and who has a special focus in working with Catholic organizations' archives, is here with us today. Brenna, Cussen, and Galata is a founding member of the Catholic Truth and Healing, a collaborative group of archivists, historians, concerned Catholics, and tribal members who, over the course of 2 years, compiled and refined a list of 87 Catholic-operated Native American boarding schools, many of which most people did not know existed before then. This was the first time to actually collaborate together and put together the list of Catholic-operated boarding schools in the United States. She's also a founding member of the St. Isidore Catholic Worker Farm, and she works with Nuns and Nuns Land Justice Project, working with Catholic communities, discussing possibilities to rematriate land back to indigenous communities. One of her collaborators, Macaw Black Elk, wishes he could be here. He's in Japan, so we can forgive him for not making the trip to Minnesota. Macaw Black Elk has also served as executive director for Truth and Healing at Maya Paluta, Red Cloud in Red Cloud in Pine Ridge, South Dakota. He graciously filmed a short video for us that Brenna will be sharing this evening. Please help me welcome Brenna, Cussen, and Galata.
Thank you so much, Ted, for that welcome. Thank you, all of you, for having me today here at St. John's and St. Ben's. I've just received, with Eric here, my husband, we've received so much hospitality and welcome. I feel like I've been here for a week, even though I just arrived this morning. So just gratitude, deep gratitude to all of you, the monks, the sisters, the students, the staff. Thank you. As Ted said, my name is Brenna, Cussen, and Galata, and I live with Eric and two other families at St. Isidore Catholic Worker Farm in southwest Wisconsin, which is the ancestral homeland of the Ho-Chunk, the Meskwaki, and the Sauk, as well as other Native nations. At our Catholic Worker Farm, our community commits ourselves to regular spiritual practice, communal life, right relationship with the earth, hospitality, education, and decolonization and nonviolent action. At least we try to do these things, and we support each other in doing them. And as Ted said, up until recently, I worked for the last 3 years with Land Justice Futures, which is an organization that's supporting Catholic sisters to make decisions about the future of their land and property that's in alignment with their values of both racial and ecological healing. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And for the last 5 years, I've been working with fellow Catholics around seeking how to be accountable and move toward repair, but to be accountable for the grievous harm of our participation in the operation of Native boarding schools in the U.S. And I'm here to share with you tonight why, as a Catholic, I believe that this is some of the most important work that the church needs to be about today. It's the healing the harm that we as a church have perpetuated through the colonization of this continent. And that harm in the last 500 years has manifested itself in many ways, but perhaps most devastatingly through the theft and destruction of land and the operation of native boarding schools. But I'm also here to share some of the hopeful acts of repair that religious communities in particular in the church are engaged in. About 10 years ago, soon after the publication of his monumental encyclical Laudato Si, which strongly correlates the way we treat the earth today to the way we treat those in our society who are the most poor or most marginalized, Pope Francis talked about this time, this era that we're living in today, a time of great ecological and racial injustice, as a particularly important time. He talks about it that we're not just living in an era of change, but that we're living through a change of an era. So especially on this continent, 500 years ago, Europeans who were emboldened by decrees from the church came to this continent to colonize it. And what has followed has been 500 years of racial and ecological harm. So I believe, along with Pope Francis and with so many others, that now is the moment for a great healing of these harms. Now is the time for a new way of being here on this continent. And I believe that the Catholic Church can play a really critical role in this healing if we choose to. So a bit more about myself and how I came to this work. This is the best picture I could find. We're not a big picture community, so not everyone in that picture is actually from my community. Most of us are, though. So I live at St. Isidore Catholic Worker Farm, as I said. I've been a member of the Catholic Worker Movement for about a little over 25 years, actually. For those of you who aren't familiar, ask Claire Freed, who's in here somewhere. Just kidding, but you really can. But also, she grew up in the Catholic Worker. The Catholic Worker is a movement of intentional communities. There's close to 200 around the world, most of which are in the U.S., who live together and attempt to live out the values of Catholic social teaching, in particular providing hospitality for those who need a place to stay and working for peace and justice. In 2015, so about 10 years ago, and well into my time already as a Catholic worker, our movement, including myself, underwent what you might call a really powerful spiritual transformation and deepening into this work. So it was about 10 years ago, 11 now, in 2014, that Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri by police. Michael was an unarmed Black teenager. And at the time, the Catholic Worker in the Midwest, led in large part by the Catholic Worker community in St. Louis, and all of us it's a majority white movement around the country, and in particular in the Midwest. So we began doing a deep dive into looking at how we as a movement were upholding white supremacy and an unjust system of violence against people of color, and in particular, Black people of color and Indigenous people. And our community living on land, 25 acres of land in rural Wisconsin, our farm community members began to want to take seriously, looking more closely at how it was that we, as white people, descendants of immigrants and settlers on this land, actually came to own land in southwest Wisconsin, given that up until quite recently, it had been stewarded for time immemorial by Indigenous people and Indigenous nations. Frankly, at that time in 2014-15, we didn't even really know which Indigenous nations had stewarded the land before us. We didn't know the circumstances about how it came to change hands. Like, was it forced removal? Was it treaty? We didn't know. We just knew that at one time it was stewarded by Indigenous people. And now we held the deed to it. What happened in between? So we knew that if we were going to be in right relationship with this land on which we lived, then we needed to take responsibility to start learning some of that history and see what we could do to make amends. Also around that time, in 2015, my spouse, so Eric, and I attended a conference in Minneapolis called Theology, Identity, and Place. At that conference, I had the incredible opportunity, we both had, to meet Jim Bear Jacobs, who's a member of the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation, lives in Minneapolis. He's also a Christian pastor. And he's been given permission by Dakota elders to lead groups of non-Native people, both Native and non-Native, primarily non-Native people, attend to various sites around Minneapolis where he tells the story in place of both the genesis of the Dakota people at the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers, their genesis, their Garden of Eden. He takes us to that place and tells that story, which is also the same place where the U.S. government attempted genocide against the Dakota people and held a concentration camp for women and children in the winter of 1862. So I got to participate in this incredibly moving 4 or 5 hour storytelling in place in Minneapolis, which I highly recommend if you haven't been on this. He does them many times throughout the year to attend. But for the first time for me, it hit home that not so long ago in this country, there was a very deliberate attempt using very deliberate laws and policies to wipe out an entire people. And I realized then that it was those policies of land theft, that's what enabled me to own land, 25 acres in southwest Wisconsin today. Not long after that, so a lot of things were happening around this time for me. I met Dr. Denise Lajamoder. She is an artist, an incredibly talented artist, birch bark biting artist. So I attended a talk by her and 2 other Indigenous women artists, just wanting to learn more from Native people. And after her talk, my friend Kristen, who attended the talk with me, and I went up just to talk to her and hear more about her skills at birch bark biting. Kristen also happens to be a Sinsinawa Dominican sister. And we got to talking to Dr. Denise Lajamoder, and she found out Kristen was a Dominican sister, and I was Catholic. She asked us what we knew about boarding schools, the history of boarding schools in this country, and the Catholic operation of those boarding schools. And we had to admit, not much. And Kristen and I, we were both members of JV, we were both Jesuit Volunteers International. I was part of the Catholic Worker. We both kind of thought of ourselves as these social justice Catholics. And we knew almost nothing about the history of boarding schools in this country. I knew a little bit about Canada, but not much. Dr. Lajamoder was one of the founders of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. So the first time I heard about them, they were pretty new at that time. She introduced us to them, and she told us she was in the middle of writing this book right here, Stringing Rosaries. She was conducting interviews with, I believe, 12, I don't remember the number, survivors of Catholic-run boarding schools in Minnesota and the Dakotas. And she was taking a much needed mental health break because she had been experiencing too much secondhand trauma, and it was really, even doing these interviews was really detrimental to her health. The book has since been published, but she said she had been spending hours upon hours not only conducting these interviews with people from her own nation and other neighbor nations, but also she had been sitting in the archives room at Marquette University, the Catholic archives room, digging through boxes upon boxes upon boxes. She would spend a week at a time there to find out just basic information about boarding schools that this country, the non-Native population in this country, is for the most part largely unaware of. So she challenged us, she lovingly invited us and challenged us firmly to do our own work as Catholics. She's like, I'm willing to do this, and the Catholic Church needs to be doing this work too. You did this, so you should know your own history and let others know about this. So we took this seriously, and for me, as a lifelong Catholic, I remember the place where I prayed later, after these encounters, standing in the streets of Dubuque, asking God to, however God wanted to do it, I had no idea, to help me be a part of the healing of this history. So before being a part of the healing, I obviously had to learn a little more specifically about what some of these harms were. And I'm guessing some of you are familiar, so I won't spend a ton of time, but a little bit here. Does anybody know what this document might be? Very good. From one of the brothers. Yeah, this is one of the papal bulls, one of the 3 papal bulls written in the 15th and 16th centuries, letters, decrees by popes that make up what then became sort of grandfathered into United States laws. It's sort of made up this political philosophy called the doctrine of discovery. But it was basically the moral and legal and ethical sort of impetus from the church that encouraged Europeans to invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue all non-Christians, and declaring any land that wasn't inhabited by Christians to be available, to be claimed by European Christians outright. So it served as the justification of the colonization of the Americas, these 3 papal decrees. And it led to the attempted genocide of indigenous peoples, the theft of their land, and by 1914, the colonization of 84% of land on Earth by European nations. As many of you are aware, the Vatican, just about 2 years ago, March of 2023, as a response to decades of incredible organizing and pressure by indigenous nations in Canada and the US, publicly repudiated the ideas in this doctrine of discovery, saying these ideas were antithetical to Catholic teaching. So that was a huge step, and it was in response to a lot of pressure, again, in organizing by indigenous nations. But just an apology alone does not change the harm that's come about as a result of these 500 years that have stemmed from the doctrine, which this doctrine is an active legal doctrine in the U.S. It's used actively in Supreme Court cases. The first one in 1823, Johnson versus McIntosh, where the Supreme Court cited that discovery is the foundation of title, and this overlooks all proprietary rights in the natives. And again, they cited it in 2005, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in a case denying the Oneida sovereignty over their land in New York, citing the doctrine of discovery, which stemmed from these papal bulls. And that, again, is how I get to own my land in Wisconsin. That's how property law works. That's the first case that all lawyers learn in law school when they take a class on property law, is what I hear. Because of this, today 98% of private rural land in the United States is owned by white people or white-led institutions. So 98% of private rural land in the United States is owned by white people and white-led institutions. And I would say that's as a direct result of this doctrine. Then the U.S. relied on this doctrine and many other carefully crafted policies that it developed toward Native people over the next few centuries in order to gain control over Native land. From the forced removal period, a lot of you know about the Indian Removal Act of the 1830s and the infamous Trail of Tears, but where all Native nations were forced to move west of the Mississippi. There was the policy of reservations, forcing nations onto reservations, the policy of allotment, where Native land was broken up into lots and then the excess sold off to white people or to corporations. There was the period of relocation and termination. There's been all of these designed policies, and they all are resulting in the idea of to gain control over land. And I would say many people would say boarding schools, well, it was a direct also policy. Boarding schools was part of this governmental policy to gain access and control of more land. The idea being that if Native people assimilated to white culture and lost their indigeneity through these schools and no longer identified with their families or their culture or their homeland, if they weren't Native anymore, then they didn't relate to their homeland, and that would make it all the easier for the U.S. to take more land. But it was seen as a more benevolent approach than just outright removal or massacre. This policy actually began, I was talking in a class earlier this afternoon, the NABS, the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, or NABS, would say this policy really had its roots starting in 1819 with the Indian Civilization Act, which gave federal money to church-run schools, so Catholic and other Christian denomination-run schools that were teaching English and promoting white ways of life in an attempt to, like, quote, civilize Native folks. So that was a forerunner to then the eventual policy in the late 1800s, where it became mandatory for Native families to send their children to these schools. Captain Richard Henry Pratt, who was one of the founders of these schools, stated that the explicit purpose of the schools was to kill the Indian and save the man. According to the most recent research, so just in the last couple of years, the Department of the Interior has been basing a lot of its research on research that NABS has done, and NABS is really the forerunner in the United States of researching. They recently came out with their most comprehensive list to date of boarding schools that existed in the U.S. in this time period, and it's 526. 526 schools run by the U.S. government, many run by Christian denominations. 87 of them were run by Catholics. And this is just boarding schools alone. This doesn't include day schools or asylums or sanitariums or orphanages or other institutions. This is just boarding schools. 526, and counting probably. They keep researching more and more and keep being uncovered. So by 1926, nearly 83% of Indian school-age children were attending boarding schools. So that's over 60,000 children in 1926. At most of these schools, children were not allowed to speak their own languages, practice their own culture, wear their own clothing. Some were removed from their families as young as 4 years old and didn't see their parents again until graduation. Many grew ill, some died from neglect. Many were subject to physical, psychological, and sexual abuse. Many went home as young adults who no longer remembered the shared language of their families and their nations or the customs. So the intergenerational trauma caused by this abuse and isolation continues to reverberate today. It's an active trauma that needs to be healed, that needs a lot of healing. And so even though 2 years ago, the Vatican has publicly rejected the statements made in the papal documents, I would say apologies, while they are necessary, absolutely they're necessary. By themselves, they're not nearly sufficient. So the harms that are brought about by the doctrine of discovery can only begin to be dismantled through a deep commitment to repair. And this commitment needs to be coming from also from those who participated in this harm, and especially those of us in the church. And I would say, who better to spearhead this repair than religious communities in the US and Canada, who for the most part ran these schools despite intentions. I know some often intentions were good, but we know what the harmful impacts were and continue to be. Religious communities are also made up today of people who are deeply spiritually grounded, committed to the hard and slow spiritual transformation that's going to be necessary, has been and will continue to be necessary to engage in this hard work of repair. So after meeting Dr. Elijah Moder, I began researching NABs and doing in the work that they were doing around bringing the truth of boarding schools to light in this country. And as I said, while it was becoming clear to me that it's almost impossible to meet a Native person in this country whose life has not been intimately impacted by this history, about 10 years ago, I knew almost no other white Catholics or non-Native Catholics who were at all aware of this history of boarding schools. It was only after the horrific uncovering of the unmarked graves of 215 children in Kamloops, Canada, at that boarding school that was run by Catholics. That became a huge news item in the U.S. in 2021. And that, when that became a huge news item, that's when the population in the United States outside of the Native community began to wake up to this horrific history. And that discovery of those unmarked graves, again, only really came about because of the hard work and the insistence over many years by the Native nations whose lives were impacted by that school. They did that work. But before that, in the fall of 2020, again, I didn't know any other Catholics who knew about this history, non-Native Catholics. So there was a few small groups. I started reaching out and asking anyone and everyone who I knew in social justice circles, like who knows about this and wants to do something about this. And not surprisingly, we found there's a few groups who found each other. So St. John, St. Ben's, I don't know if INNR was here then, but we met Sister Pat, who was working with Jamie Arsenal over Zoom at the time. There was Macabre Black Elk working as the director of Truth and Healing at Red Cloud Indian School, and some Jesuits working with him. The Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration had just kind of discovered through a news reporter that they had run a boarding school and had began a process of deep soul searching that they're still going through about what is their responsibility now toward repair. We started finding some archivist at St. Paul Diocese. There was an archivist at Marquette. And we found each other and began meeting monthly to share what we were up to, what might be best practices, what we thought could be done together as members or members of the Catholic Church or as people who worked for the Catholic Church. And through a lot of consultation among each other and also with some tribal representatives, we realized how vitally important it was for survivors and descendants of boarding schools to have access even just to basic information about what had happened to them, their relatives, their family members, their tribal nations, their tribal members. And we realized that a lot of this information was not always on purpose hidden away, but a lot of people didn't even know these archives existed, where they were, who had them, how many schools there were, where they were. And a lot of this information was in church basements or mother houses and monasteries around the country. So as more archivists of Catholic dioceses and religious communities continued to join, they agreed this was really important work and wanted to help facilitate organization and transparency as a first step. It's just a first tiny step that the church could take toward what would hopefully lead towards some repair. It's clear that harm can't really be repaired until we know what actually happened after the truth is told. But again, at the time, we had no idea how many schools Catholics had even run, where they were located. There had been this huge 150-year-old history, and then compounding that history, there was an almost complete silence about it. I'd like to share a little story about how that I heard from Macaw Black Elk, who again at the time was the director of Truth and Healing at Red Cloud, about how access to archives and basic information can have a huge healing impact on people's lives. So he shared this story during a webinar that our group collectively put on, that I was sharing with some students, that we put on a 4-part webinar series and then further webinars about archives that hundreds upon hundreds of communities, people signed up for it, the majority of which were women religious. So Macaw shared that while he was the director of Truth and Healing at Red Cloud, he had a colleague, a woman, whose father had attended boarding school as a child. He had been taken from his home forcibly when he was 6 and didn't return home at all till he was 18. He had always carried around a lot of pain and resentment because the whole time he was gone, he never heard from his mother. It appeared to him she never made any attempt to contact him, to try to get him to come home to visit during the summer. So on top of the pain of boarding school, he had this traumatic pain of that his family had kind of abandoned him. So he carried around a lot of pain and anger as an adult. As he was nearing the end of his own life and was an elder, this woman, his daughter, this woman who's Macaw's colleague, decided with some of her other family members they wanted to learn more about the history of this time that he had been at boarding school. So they traveled to his former school, and because they were family, they got some access to some of the archival materials, and they looked through them and opened up the stuff and made Xerox copies and brought them back to the hotel room where they were staying because they had to leave the records there. And they called her father, and they let him know, they started reading to him all of these letters that his mother had written to him while he was at boarding school, most of which had never been opened by even the superintendent. She had sent money to get him to come home for the summer and had asked about how he was doing. She contacted him a lot and tried to get him to come home, and those letters were ignored. But this in itself was so healing for this man, whose mother had since died, so he wasn't able to reconcile directly with her, but he was able to feel her love and that forgiveness. So that's one way that just having access to archives, as tedious as it can be to look through all of these boxes and boxes of materials, it matters in people's lives. So many boarding school survivors and their descendants are still alive today, and a lot of these archives are still not organized and hard to access. So there's really no time to waste. So our group that was getting together decided that a first step that we could do would be to even figure out how to make archivals more accessible to Native communities, nations, and survivors and descendants. So it took our group of many trained archivists 2 years and a lot of meticulous research and consulting with tribal nations, representatives from tribal nations, and consulting with religious communities to make sure the information we had was accurate, combing through official Catholic directories, combing through archives at Marquette. But we were able to create a list of 87, the first ever list of 87 Catholic-run Native boarding schools in the U.S. and who ran them, because some schools may have only been run by one religious order, but some were open for so long, like 100 years or more, that many religious orders came in and out. And so many different religious orders have archives on just one school, and those archives could be in places all over the country. So we were just trying to get some organization to make it easier for members of tribal nations or people, descendants of people who had been to these schools, to find out even where they were and how to access them. We also put together a resource guide for religious communities that was guided in large part by Makah, Black Elk, for what steps to take if you know your community has these archives, who to reach out to with tribal nations, how to collaborate with them on how and if these archives should be shared, how to build a working relationship. Because as I know you all are realizing at this school, there's a lot of privacy, a lot of information about people's personal histories, not only about the children who attended these schools, but also the teachers who ran them. So how can we collaborate to make sure everyone's privacy and culture is respected? And I know the monks and sisters at this school and the students, guided in large part by Professor Gordon, have been doing a lot of work, and it takes a lot of time, and there can be a lot of confusion along the way and a lot of labor, but this is the important work that is so important for the church to be about, that I believe are just the labors of love that need to be taken as steps toward healing. So thank you for being some of the first Catholic communities in the nation who are doing this hard work. A major step in the truth and healing process, I will say, is the issue of burials. So our group has been talking for a while about this is something we want to try to figure out how to provide some guidance on for Catholic communities. Because as I said earlier, the issue of boarding schools came to the awareness of many non-Native people in the U.S. after the discovery of children's remains at Kamloops, a Catholic-run school, 215 of them, and then a month later, 751 children discovered in unmarked graves at another Indian residential school that was also Catholic-run. And both of these schools, these children were discovered when a lot of non-Native people were saying, we don't think there are that many graves. We don't think there are that many graves. And the Native community was saying, we know that there are. We have stories about children who died. And they insisted on uncovering this. That hasn't really been done to a large extent here in the United States. So I think there's a lot more unmarked graves in the United States than we have any idea. A federal report came out last year, the Department of Interior last summer, that had identified the remains of at least 1,000 children in the United States, but even they said they barely scratched the surface of the research that needs to be done to find more. And because many records on these burials weren't kept well, or if at all, we don't have any idea of how many children are buried and where. I know that last year, the remains of 4 boys who were buried here were returned to White Earth. 4 children who had attended St. John's Industrial School in the late 1800s and who died while at the school and had been buried in St. John's Abbey's cemetery. So last September, their remains were returned to White Earth. 2 in a traditional Ojibwe ceremony were buried, and 2 were buried in a Catholic cemetery because they were members of the Catholic Church. I believe that this may have been the first time in the United States where any remains from a Catholic-run boarding school were repatriated to a tribal community of the children who were buried. There's repatriation efforts happening with the U.S. government from the big school that was run in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, but I think this is the first Catholic repatriation that happened. I just want to express to you all how big of a deal that is. That is huge. That is such a huge step toward the repair that needs to be happening in this country. Burials of your loved ones. As we know, as Catholics, the act of burying the dead is one of the works of mercy that Jesus asked of us. It's one of the most sacred acts that any community or nation of people, it's one of the most sacred acts that any community of faith can participate in. Every culture has a unique understanding and spirituality around what happens to our souls and our bodies after we die, and it informs so much about who we are as a people and how we live. In the Catholic faith, we take really seriously the way we treat the dead, how we're buried, how we say goodbye to our loved ones in a community. And from what little I know of indigenous cultures in the United States, from different people that I've met from different indigenous cultures, care and protection of their ancestors and their loved ones who have died is among the most sacred and serious than any other culture that I've encountered. As I said, we live in the ancestral homeland of the Ho-Chunk, and we've had the privilege to meet with several members of the Ho-Chunk Nation, including their tribal historic preservation officer, who does a lot of work around finding burials of his people from the removal period from Wisconsin, and making sure those burials are well taken care of. And we have heard the Ho-Chunk were forcibly removed from Wisconsin at least 7 times. Some say up to 10 or 11 times. And some remained on the Winnebago reservations out in Nebraska and Oklahoma. But many kept returning back to Wisconsin, even though they were not allowed to be in Wisconsin. And we've heard that they kept returning back because that's where their ancestors were buried, and they felt a sacred obligation to protect their ancestors, to protect these burials. The burial act of burying the dead and how we treat the dead is among the most sacred acts we can do as a community. So I just want to say thank you for participating here at this school, at this monastery, in respecting the tribe's wishes. It's not always to disinter and repatriate remains. Different tribal communities will ask different things of once they find where their loved ones are buried. They may wish to have them remain there, but the act of engaging in relationships so that people can actually make that decision is going to be so important as we discover more and more people who are buried. Let's see. I want to share a few words from Macaw Black Elk, and then right after I share those from him, I just want to share with you a few little stories of hope to close out our time together, and then we'll take some questions. But he has about an 8-minute video, and again, we're really grateful that he sent this from his office in Japan. Macaw, he'll introduce himself. He's both Catholic and Lakota from Pine Ridge, and he'll say a few words about himself and the importance of truth and healing work.
Haomitakeapi, le makakanaji machapelo. Good greetings to all of you, and I greet you with a heartfelt handshake. My name is Macaw Black Elk, and I've been asked by Brenna to share some words with you regarding some of the work that's been happening around Indian boarding schools and the relationship between them and the Catholic Church. I come to this conversation having formerly been the Director of Truth and Healing at Red Cloud Indian School in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, which was a former Indian boarding school run by the Jesuits and the Franciscan Sisters of Christian Charity and Penance. And that is still an existing Catholic school today on an Indian reservation. I'm also an alumni from the school, and my ancestors went to that school both in its time as a day school and in its time as a former Indian boarding school. I also come to this conversation being both someone who identifies as Lakota from my tribe, having practicing my Lakota spirituality, culture, and customs, and prayers and rituals, as well as being a practicing Catholic, and who grew up as a Catholic and is baptized and confirmed, and remains an active participant in my Catholic prayer life. I think it's important to talk about this history of relationship between the Catholic Church and Native peoples, because it marks a very clear and important way in which the Church is both an important mechanism of colonial power, of sort of oppressive forces, and simultaneously, and certainly in deep contrast, a possible force of reckoning and healing, and relationship, vibrant relationship. I know it's hard to sort of think of those two things as being one and the same, but that's importantly a space that the Church occupies. I think the best thing that ever helped me kind of think about this relationship has to do with an article that was written by theologian Brett Salkeld, who is a theologian out of Canada, where Canada has been more deeply engrossed in the conversation around sort of reconciliation and the history of Canadian schools that took on the role of removing children from their homes and placing them in these boarding environments, Canada's residential school system, of which half were run by the Catholic Church. In the United States, that figure is less, but the Catholic Church still ran a number of Indian boarding schools in the United States. And it's important to recognize the history of that, especially the history in which there was the involvement of abuses and just that overall history itself. And I point to Brett Salkeld's article because he pointed out two things about the Church's involvement in this work. One, he pointed out that we can recognize that the Church committed a sin and an atrocity here through a couple of things. One is just the key belief of the Church that the parent is the first teacher, and the sacredness of the parent-child relationship as manifested in the Holy Family. And the Church, in engaging in the forced removal of children from their homes, violated that in a very clear way. And secondly, the Church didn't engage in what is an important and pivotal idea in especially the history of the founding of the Church through St. Peter and the apostles, that when they were sent out to mission to other parts of the world, that when they were engaged in when people in the aftermath were also engaged in the translation of that work, they did so in those people's communities, in those people's languages. And that was when the Church decided that it was it was not a church of one culture, but a church of all cultures. And yet, here in the situation of boarding schools, the Church, with many indigenous peoples, not just in the United States, but around the world, anchored itself as a church of one culture rather than a church of many. And so we can see both of those things as like inherently sinful and violation of core beliefs that the Church has, that Jesus also gave us. And those things help us recognize two things: the important nature of continuing this work and the important nature of recognizing the goodness of those origins, that it was a violation of faith to do this to begin with, and thus a renewal of faith to heal and move forward and be and live up to the gospel values that we hold. And so that very nature of the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Catholic Church, to me, yes, is both a mark of colonial history that needs to be reckoned with, and a powerful reminder of where the church went wrong from its own goodness, and why that then calls us to a renewal of the goodness that the gospel called us to. So with that, I sort of offer that as a form of reflection. One of the reasons why I think it's so important to communicate this idea is because so often there's two reactions to this history of the church's involvement in the removal of Native children and the sort of indoctrination that occurred and the abuses that occurred in the aftermath. And those two responses are typically either a mournful sort of a mournful and angry and even maybe a shaking of faith in the church itself, or the other response is a sort of defensiveness and a desire to sort of excuse the church's behavior. Neither of those responses, I think, is what is true to the heart of this issue. That this is both an opportunity to see where the church has failed and correct those failures, and an opportunity to live up to the gospel truth that we profess. And so to take it in that sense, that this is our chance to show deeper goodness, deeper relationship, and a deeper adherence to the principles that Christ left us with. Thank you.
I always love hearing him speak. He's just really well spoken about this. I just want to close out. I know we're coming up on the hour, but I have just 2 more minutes to share a story of the kinds of healing that can take place when we do this work. As I mentioned, I work with Land Justice Futures. So we work with communities of women religious who are discerning what to do with their land in the future. And we work toward steering them toward options that are rooted in ecological and racial healing. One of the communities we work with, the Sisters of St. Joseph in Brentwood, New York, Long Island, have been engaging in a really powerful partnership in the last several years that came about through meeting some of these powerful women here. I know the women, I don't know the man in the background, but Tila Troge and Becky Genia from the Shinnecock Nation. The Shinnecock have been in Long Island for 13,000 plus years. And a lot of their ancestors' remains have been disturbed or built over by golf courses and rich people's homes. And they started several years ago this Shinnecock Graves Protection Warrior Society, the goal of which is to recover their ancestral remains and bury them properly in sacred sites so they won't be disturbed anymore. And that's supported by the national law, the NAGPRA national law as well. So, but the Shinnecock don't have a whole lot of land because they were relegated to a tiny marshy part of the island, which is where their reservation is. So they've collaborated with many groups, including the Sisters of St. Joseph and a Peconic Land Trust, to find places on the island where they can bury the remains of their ancestors, which were either disturbed or being held in museums or other places where they shouldn't be. Through that collaboration with the sisters, they were also, some of these same women formed the Shinnecock Kelp Farmers Collective. The kelp farming is an ancient Shinnecock practice. They've been doing it for 10,000 plus years. And it also has the incredible benefit of not only being their ancestral practice, but it sucks carbon out of the ocean. It cleans up the polluted waters, and there's a lot of polluted bays in Long Island, and it mitigates climate change. Kelp farming has incredible beneficial ecological impacts. But again, they live on a marshy part of the island. Their reservation, they needed access to a better part of the bay, which are mostly taken up by rich people's mansions. So they approached these sisters after the Graves collaboration, and they said, could we use, you have 7 acres on St. Joseph's Retreat Center in the Hamptons. Could we use your land? And the sisters said yes. So the kelp farming has been happening there on the St. Joseph Retreat Center for the last about 3 years. It is doing incredible things for the water, doing a lot of cleaning, capturing carbon, removing nitrogen, et cetera, et cetera. And the sisters are currently working with the Shinnecock kelp farmers to figure out the best way to eventually rematriate this land so that it will eventually transfer ownership either back to the kelp farmers or to a land trust that they are in process of creating so that the land can once again belong to the Shinnecock. So this beautiful relationship that says, Sister Joan says, a future emerges from the relationships we cultivate in the present. I just want to return to this quote by Pope Francis. We're not just living in a era of change, but in a change of era. And these new relationships that are based on healing, how can we heal these harms with which we've been involved for the last 500 years? That's what's going to bring about this change of era. It's the work that you all are doing here at St. John, St. Ben's. It's the work that these little pockets of Catholic communities are working, following the lead of many Native nations, and we're listening to them and this healing for it to take place. So I just want to say thank you for being leaders and early models in this work, and may it continue. And I would like to stop talking so that I can leave room for any questions. Any discussion, questions? Thank you. Questions or comments? I just kind of threw out a lot there, so I'm open. Oh, is there a mic? Great. And if you have one, we'll bring you the mic.
Hello. Thank you for talking tonight.
Sure.
It was a lovely presentation. I have a question. So you talked about being Catholic yourself, and also encountering all these different historical events that are placed on, or that the Catholic Church did and perpetuates now. And I'm wondering how that's affected your relationship with your own religious and spiritual practice, and if that's affected the community that you kind of go to support you in that.
That's a really good question. That's thank you for a really hard question. So the answer is yes, it has impacted me greatly. It's hard. It's really hard. The Catholic Church is how I met God. That's how God was introduced to me, and I can't not be Catholic. Being Catholic is in my bones. And I love the Catholic Church for how it has introduced me to God through the material world, through candles, through incense, through Mass, through the sacraments, like the communion of saints, all of it. I love it. And so I go through a lot. I'm really angry. I want to leave. I am how can I be part of this institution? But then I'm where else can I go? I don't know where else I would go. There's also a part of me that feels responsible. I'm it would be easy for me to walk away and well, I don't know about easy, but I could walk away and not take responsibility for what my church has done. And then who's going to take responsibility? We've done grievous harm. And if those of us who are angry about that harm just leave, then there's no one left to make amends. So I think sometimes that's what keeps me going and staying. So yeah, I'm still Catholic, and I probably will be for the rest of my life, but I can't guarantee it because it's really hard to know what we have done. And what I think part of what helps me keep going is like there are Catholics who are trying to write a new story and not shy away from the harmful past we've engaged in. So these women, these Sisters of St. Joseph, there's other women that we work with that helps me. Like, yeah, we're staying in. I could be more articulate about it, but I probably am not that articulate about it because it's really hard sometimes. Yeah, it's a hard thing.
Thank you so much, Brenna. And we had a chance to talk today, and I'm so grateful. Thank you for your presentation and for everything that you named in here. Just want to acknowledge that when the 4 children were repatriated in September, I had no language for that. I really struggled as a campus minister to even know how to talk about that with students, especially because it was our abbey and, our land, or like the land here. And so to hear from you that this place was one of the first to do that, like, is validating for the feeling of like, there was no roadmap for this. Like,
None.
so, and while there was still the gospel and like feelings of conviction present, it was still like, how do we talk about this? What's the language for this? Like, but words that you've used here and the ways that you've modeled this from a Catholic perspective are incredibly helpful to the work that I hope we can continue to do here. A question I had is I was really curious in just some of your archival work of the 87 schools that you found, did you encounter any schools or religious orders that maybe refused that funding from the government that would have said, okay, we see what you're trying to do here, and this seems incredibly wrong. We're not going to do this.
I don't have specific examples. I know early on there were some communities and priests who wrote copious letters to the U.S. government saying saying this is wrong. There was not a mass movement of Catholics saying that, I will say, but there were some, and I think maybe some resisted more quietly. Yeah, but I think the trend in general was cooperation. But there, I think, I know Ted's class was talking about these nets that were, anyway, maybe that's a little too complicated. But there were, I think, small pockets of resistance and knowing what was right, but ultimately, like, succumbing to just cooperating with the government. Yeah, no, I don't know of any specific ones. I'm not saying they didn't exist, but it wasn't a big part of the research, no.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and talking. I'm a current student at the School of Theology, and I'm also an FJV myself. I just needed to plug that out there. And the question I have, I don't know if I'm going to articulate it. I'm not going to articulate it perfectly, but I'm going to try. As somebody who is a white Christian that's also committed to doing this faith-based work and this social justice work, I have a hard time of knowing what my place is. I don't want to continue in the colonialistic, a nature on native land and like imposing more, but I also want to do the restorative justice work. So I'm wondering if you have any tips or tricks of knowing what is the appropriate place for a Christian that has this history to show up in without continuing in a harmful nature. I hope that question makes sense.
Sure, I think so. Yeah, thank you. I think you articulated it really well. And I can try, and then Eric, if you have things to add, I'd appreciate any assistance. But I'd say like a big thing is to do our own homework and learn our own history. So do as much reading as we can about this history. There's a lot of resources that exist out there. The National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, I turned to them a lot. There's a lot of Native authors. There's so many good books out there and videos and documentaries. So just to learn our own history so that we're not stumbling into situations ignorant of what we carry. And then to show up when we're invited, especially in situations of support. Like I know not too long ago here in Minnesota, there was a big call for people to support the Anishinaabe-led, mostly Ojibwe women-led resistance to Line 3, and there was a huge call for support, and it was very clear that Ojibwe women were leading that resistance, and there were like grandmothers and elders who were kind of making calls on that, but so many people showed up in support. So showing up where we're invited to support, I think would be another, and keep showing up, not just sort of like once for an experience, but keep going back and listening for what would be helpful in your situations. I will say the first time I emailed Dr. Denise Lajamoder after meeting her, and I said, we're trying to create this list. We don't even know how to define a boarding school. Like, can you give us some tips on how you defined it? Because it gets tricky with like day schools and if they receive federal funding or not, all these, you need kind of guidelines for what defines it. And she more or less sent a pretty curt email saying, do your own work. So I was like, okay, that's fine. And then 3 years later, I emailed her back and said, we have this list. It's coming out. People might contact you for a press release. And I think she sent a much longer email in response and gratitude, kind of like, oh, you're still here. 3 years later, you're still here. So that felt good. It was like, I listened, I did the work, and I'm gonna keep trying to do the work. Eric, do you have any? Okay, thanks.
I want to affirm that you mentioned the bookstore, Birch Bark, in the cities. Really highlights for me the intersectional identities at play, because if you go into that bookstore, they have the old confessional, right? And then we heard from Mr. Black Elk, you said?
Yes.
And that intersectional identity at play too. So I really like to listen in when we hear from voices like that, that are within the church and have that intersectional identity. I think that helps us sustain faith and to really listen in on that intercultural piece of the church. So thanks for including that. That's important.
Thanks. Yes, if you haven't been to Birch Bark Bookstore in Minneapolis, it's a really wonderful bookstore.
Thank you so much for your presentation. This is probably more of a comment just to hear what your reflections are. There is absolutely no doubt that this was a very painful and wrong aspect of what we did as a church and what we were very much participating in as religious women, unbeknowing. Pascal said that evil is done no so well as when it's done in the guise of good and right. And I think that's clearly what happened. But I would be interested if there were any of the communities that you've worked with, particularly women's communities, that indicated that there were some people that were interviewed or people who wrote of gratitude or a closeness to the sisters, because I do think that that's another part, and it's something that we have experienced. The other dimension, and in listening to you tonight, it's the first time I really realized it. Perhaps, and this is where you can comment if you would, perhaps it's women religious particularly who were the bulk of the people who were part of this in teaching in the schools. There were certainly some men's religious communities. But as women, and as women religious, we are marginalized even to this day. And so therefore, we have a sense of what it means to be marginalized and what it means to suffer under the oppression of others. In our case, throughout history, and there's no doubt about it, the hierarchy of the church. I'm not criticizing from the perspective it was a different time, and I think we have to also remember that. But I think the reason that I'm wondering if the reason that women religious are really moving with this is because we understand. Not totally, we don't understand their experience, but we understand the experience of what it means to be seen less than in many ways, and not have the responsibility of sharing in leadership within the church in many ways. So I would just appreciate your comments as to whether that's a fair evaluation. And if you did find that there were some people who were very close to the sisters, felt very good about their education, and some did go home. They did go home in the summertime. They did go home for vacations. And I do think that that's another piece that people should know. Thank you very much.
Sure. I'll maybe start with the first that you said. So I didn't port through archives myself. We found the list of what schools were operated and who operated them, so that we could point people who were looking for those archives in the right direction. But Macabre Black Elk, who spoke and who's done a lot of work in his own Lakota community, and people who went to what is now Red Cloud Indian School, I think it used to be called Holy Rosary, there were mixed experiences. Over the course of 150 years, there's going to be different time periods. There's going to be different teachers who were at the time, there were different ways of thinking. So even at the same school, two different students could have a very different experience at the same school at the same time. So there are some fond memories, and so that's part of the healing work of archives too, because there's so much assumption that everything was horrible. Then you might uncover like some really positive stories and a picture of your smiling great-grandfather who was like having a wonderful time, and that can be healing as well. I don't think that can, because people are good. There's good people everywhere, and good people can shine through the darkness. That doesn't make up for what was a genocidal policy and our cooperation with it as a church. But that doesn't mean that every single person who participated was always doing evil. So yeah, there are mixed experiences. So it's a complicated history, but it was a genocidal policy, but hope can still spring out of anywhere. On the other note, some of the work with women religious that we do, this comes up because women, they have the experience of being investigated by the Vatican and banding together. So I think knowing that they're also an oppressed class can have sort of two responses. One can be like, well, we're also an oppressed class. So it's kind of like, it's not our fault, or we've also been harmed by the patriarchy. So it can be a defensiveness. It can sort of be so don't blame us for anything we did. But the other response is more like what you've said is, we know what it's like to be on the receiving end of oppression. That opens our hearts for more compassion and solidarity, and we want to band together and work toward what could be healing. So I think both responses happen, and we have discussions about them even among community members. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you all for just having some wonderful questions. We're just being mindful of time here. Before we close out, I want to make sure that I thank St. Ben's Campus Ministry and St. John's Faith for working with the Initiative for Native Nation Relations and bringing Brenna here. What a fantastic talk. What an incredibly important conversation for us to be having here. And it's just so meaningful for you to have you here for both this talk and then some of the other conversations you're having on our campuses today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.